Realization is nothing to be gained afresh. It is already there. All that is necessary is to get rid of the thought, I have not realized. Stillness or peace is realization. There is no moment when the self is not. So long as there is doubt or the feeling of non-realization, the attempt should be made to rid oneself of these thoughts. They are due to the identification of the self with the not-self. When the not-self disappears, the self alone remains. To make room, it is enough that objects be removed. Room or space is not brought in from elsewhere. You are in that state now. The vasanas, or mental tendencies, will themselves be destroyed if you remain as you are. There is no reaching the self. If the self were to be reached, it would mean that the self is not here and now, and that it is yet to be obtained. What is got afresh will also be lost. So it will be impermanent. What is not permanent is not worth striving for. So I say, the self is not reached. You are the self. You are already that. The fact is, you are ignorant of your blissful state. Ignorance supervenes and draws a veil over the pure self, which is bliss. Attempts are directed only to remove this veil of ignorance, which is merely wrong knowledge. The wrong knowledge is the false identification of the self with the body and the mind. This false identification must go, and then the self alone remains. Therefore, realization is for everyone. Realization makes no difference between the aspirants. This very doubt, whether you can realize, and the notion, I have not realized, are themselves the obstacles. Be free from these obstacles also. mukti, or liberation, is not to be gained in the future. It is there forever, here and now. The experience is here and now. One cannot deny one's own self. Existence is the same as happiness, and happiness is the same as being. The word mukti is so provoking. Why should one seek it? One believes that there is bondage and therefore seeks liberation. But the fact is that there is no bondage, but only liberation. Why call it by a name and seek it? Only remove ignorance. That is all there is to be done. All questions relating to mukti are inadmissible. Mukti means release from bondage, which implies the present existence of bondage. But there is no bondage, and therefore no mukti either. Cosmic consciousness comes as a flash and disappears as such. That which has a beginning must also end. Only when the ever-present consciousness is realized will it be permanent. Consciousness is indeed always with us. Everyone knows I am. No one can deny their own being. The person in deep sleep is not aware. While awake, they seem to be aware. But it is the same person. There is no change in the one who slept and the one who is now awake. In deep sleep, they were not aware of their body, and so there was no body consciousness. In the wakeful state, they are aware of their body, and so there is body consciousness. Therefore, The difference lies in the emergence of body consciousness and not in any change in the real consciousness. The body and body consciousness arise together and sink together. All this amounts to saying that there are no limitations in deep sleep, whereas there are limitations in the waking state. These limitations are the bondage. The feeling, the body is I, is the error. This false sense of I must go. The real I is always there. It is here and now. It never appears anew and disappears again. That which is must also persist forever. That which appears anew will also be lost. Compare deep sleep and waking. The body appears in one state, but not in the other. Therefore, the body will be lost. The consciousness was pre-existent and will survive the body. There is no one who does not say, I am. The wrong knowledge of I am the body is the cause of all the mischief. This wrong knowledge must go. That is realization. Realization is not acquisition of anything new, nor is it a new faculty. It is only removal of all camouflage. The ultimate truth is so simple. It is nothing more than being in the pristine state. And that is all that need be said. The sleep, dream, and waking states are mere phenomena appearing on the self, which is itself stationary. It is also a state of simple awareness. Can anyone remain away from the self at any moment? The self is pure consciousness. No one can ever be away from the self. The question of separation is possible only if there is duality. But there is no duality in the state of pure consciousness. The same person sleeps, dreams, and wakes up. The waking state is considered to be full of beautiful and interesting things. The absence of such experience makes one say that the sleep state is dull. But do you not admit that you exist in your sleep? You are the same person that is now awake. Is it not so? So there is a continuity in the sleep and the waking states. What is that continuity? It is only the state of pure being. But there is a difference in the two states. What is that difference? The incidents, namely the body, the world, and the objects, appear in the waking state, but they disappear in sleep. It's true that there is no awareness of the body or of the world in one's sleep, but you must exist in your sleep in order to say now, I was not aware in my sleep. Who says so now? It is the wakeful person. The sleeper cannot say so. That is to say, the individual who is now identifying the self with the body says that such awareness did not exist in sleep. Because you identify yourself with the body, you see the world around you and say that the waking state is filled with beautiful and interesting things. The sleep state appears dull because you were not there as an individual, and therefore these things were not. But what is the fact? There is the continuity of being in all the three states, but no continuity of the individual and the objects. That which is continuous is also enduring. That is permanent. That which is discontinuous is transitory. Therefore, the state of being is permanent, and the body and the world are not. They are fleeting phenomena, passing on the screen of being consciousness, which is eternal and stationary. The sleep state is nearer to pure consciousness than the waking state, in the sense that when passing from sleep to waking, the I thought, the individual self, must start, and the mind must come into play. Then thoughts arise, and the functions of the body come into operation. All these together make us say that we are awake. The absence of all this evolution is the characteristic of sleep, and therefore it is nearer to pure consciousness than the waking state. But one should not therefore desire to be always in sleep. In the first place, it is impossible, for it will necessarily alternate with the other states. Secondly, it cannot be the state of bliss in which the jnani is immersed, for their state is permanent and not alternating. Moreover, the sleep state is not recognized to be one of awareness by people, but the sage is always aware. Thus, the sleep state differs from the state in which the sage is established. Still more, the sleep state is free from thoughts and their impression on the individual. It cannot be altered by one's will, because effort is impossible in that condition. Although nearer to pure consciousness, the sleep state is not fit for efforts to realize the self. Realization of one's absolute being is not knowledge to be acquired, so that acquiring it, one may obtain happiness. It is one's ignorant outlook that should be given up. The self you seek to know is truly yourself. Your supposed ignorance causes you needless grief, like that of the 10 foolish men in the parable, who grieved at the loss of the 10th man, who was never lost. The cause of their grief was not the real loss of anyone, it was their own ignorance, or rather, their mere supposition that one of them was lost. Such is the case with you. Truly, there is no cause for you to be miserable and unhappy. You yourself impose limitations on your true nature of infinite being, and then weep that you are but a finite creature. Then you take up this or that spiritual practice to transcend the non-existent limitations. But if your spiritual practice itself assumes the existence of the limitations, how can it help you to transcend them? Hence, I say know that you are really the infinite pure being, the self. You are always that self, and nothing but that self. Therefore, you can never be really ignorant of the self. Your ignorance is merely an imaginary ignorance, like the ignorance of the 10 fools about the lost 10th man. It is this ignorance that caused them grief. Know then that true knowledge does not create a new being for you. It only removes your ignorant ignorance. Bliss is not added to your nature. It is merely revealed as your true natural state, eternal and imperishable. The only way to be rid of your grief is to know and be the self. How can this be unattainable? People say that they are not able to know the self that is all-pervading. What can I do? Even the smallest child says, I exist. I do. This is mine. So everyone understands that the thing I is always existent. It is only when that I is there that there is the feeling that you are the body. he is so and so, this is Ramana, and so on. To know that the one that is always visible is one's own self. Is it necessary to search with a candle? To say that we do not know the real nature of the self, which is not different, but which is in one's own self, is like saying, I do not know myself. There is no goal to be reached. There is nothing to be attained. You are the self. You exist always. Nothing more can be predicated of the self than that it exists. Seeing God, or the self, is only being the self, or yourself. Seeing is being. You, being the self, want to know how to attain the self. It is something like a person being at Ramana Ashram, asking how many ways there are to reach the ashram, and which is the best way for them. All that is required of you is to give up the thought that you are this body, and to give up all thoughts of the external things or the not-self. The ego self appears and disappears and is transitory, whereas the real self is permanent. Though you are actually the true self, you wrongly identify the real self with the ego self. But the ego self does not exist at all. All the trouble is imagined. Trouble and pleasure are only for the ego. So take care of yourself and don't worry about the ignorance of the world. Let the world take care of itself. See yourself. If you are the body, there is the gross world also. If you are spirit, all is spirit alone. There is only ignorance for the ego self. Remove the ego, and ignorance is gone. Look for it. The ego vanishes, and the real self alone remains. The ego professing ignorance is not to be seen. There is no ignorance in reality. All scriptures are meant to disprove the existence of ignorance. Therefore, ego is not. Otherwise, do you admit of the two selves? How can there be ignorance in the absence of the ego? If you begin to inquire, the ignorance, which is already non-existent, will be found not to be. Or you will say, it has fled away. But ignorance pertains to the ego. Why do you think of the ego and also suffer? What is ignorance again? It is that which is non-existent. However, the worldly life requires a hypothesis of ignorance. But ignorance is only forgetfulness of the self. Can there be darkness before the sun? Similarly, can there be ignorance before the self-evident and self-luminous self? If you know the self, there will be no darkness, no ignorance, and no misery. It is the mind which feels the trouble and the misery. Darkness never comes nor go. See the sun, and there is no darkness. In the same way, see the self, and ignorance will be found not to exist. There is no such thing as the unreal from one standpoint. The self alone exists. When you try to trace the ego, which is the basis of the perception of the world and everything else, you find the ego does not exist at all, and neither does all this creation that you see. So knowing the self is simply being the self, and being means existence, one's own existence. No one denies one's existence any more than one denies one's eyes, although one cannot see them. The trouble lies with your desire to objectify the self, in the same way as you objectify your eyes when you place a mirror before them. You have been so accustomed to objectivity that you have lost the knowledge of yourself, simply because the self cannot be objectified. Who is to know the self? Can the insentient body know it? All the time you speak and think of your I, yet when questioned, you deny knowledge of it. You are the self, yet you ask how to know the self.